On a chilly autumn afternoon, the streets were unusually quiet. Fallen leaves scattered along the pavement as if nature itself was grieving. In the middle of a small rundown park sat a woman, visibly broken, with tears streaming down her face. Her 2 children, a boy no older than 10 and a girl around 7, huddled close to her on the cold, weathered bench. Their clothes were ragged, too thin for the brisk weather, and their faces wore the unmistakable marks of hunger and exhaustion. The mother's name was Laura, and her story was not unlike the millions of others who had fallen through life's cracks. Once, she had a stable job, a loving husband, and a warm home to return to. But life has a cruel way of unraveling even the strongest threads. When her husband unexpectedly passed away, Laura's world shattered. He had been the family's backbone, and without him, the bills piled up, and slowly, everything they once had slipped away. Now, there she sat, homeless, penniless, and hopeless, trying to comfort her children, despite not knowing where their next meal would come from. Each tear she shed was filled with the fear that she had failed them. But in that moment, what hurt more than hunger or cold was the feeling of utter helplessness. There was nothing left to give, no one to turn to. As people passed by, most ignored her, heads down, lost in their own worlds. It wasn't unusual to see hardship in this part of the city. Occasionally, someone would glance in her direction, pity in their eyes, but they too kept walking. Laura had learned not to expect kindness anymore. It felt like the world had forgotten her. But not everyone that day had their hearts closed. Just as the sky began to darken, signaling the approach of evening, a man named Jacob wandered into the park. Dressed in a simple coat and scarf, he had come there to clear his mind after a long, stressful day at work. Jacob wasn't wealthy, but he had enough. A small apartment, a steady job as a construction worker, and a modest savings account. He lived alone, not by choice, but because life hadn't brought him the family he quietly longed for. As he strolled through the park, something caught his eye. There, on the bench, he saw Laura and her children. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should get involved. After all, he didn't know their story, and perhaps they were just like many others who fell on hard times. But something about the way the woman held her children, shielding them from the cold with her own body, stirred a deep feeling within him. He had seen many people down on their luck before, but this felt different. Her pain seemed raw, real, and far too familiar. Jacob approached cautiously, not wanting to alarm them. "Excuse me," he said softly, trying not to startle the family. Laura glanced up, her tear-streaked face filled with a mixture of fear and weariness. Her children tightened their grip on her, sensing a stranger's presence. "I'm sorry to bother you," Jacob continued, "but are you okay? Do you need help?" Laura hesitated, unsure if she could trust him. She had been approached before by strangers who offered sympathy, but no real aid. She had learned that many people's good intentions ended in nothing. Still, there was something genuine in Jacob's eyes. She didn't know why, but she found herself nodding, though her voice was too choked with emotion to speak. Jacob sat down on the bench beside her, carefully leaving some space so as not to intrude. The silence between them was thick, and for a moment it seemed like Laura wouldn't open up. But then, something in her broke. The words came spilling out, every ounce of pain, loss, and fear she had bottled up for so long. She told him about her husband's death, about losing her job, her home, and how she had tried to keep going for the sake of her children, but had nowhere left to turn. The weight of the world pressed down on her, and she had run out of strength. As she spoke, Jacob listened quietly, his heart breaking with every word. He didn't know what he could do to help, but he knew he had to try. "Look," he said gently when she finished, I don't have much myself, but I can't just leave you here like this. You and your kids need food, a place to stay for the night. Let me help, please." Laura's eyes widened in disbelief. She had heard those words before, but this time something was different. There was sincerity in Jacob's offer, not pity, but genuine care. With nowhere else to turn, she finally nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. I don't know what else to say, but thank you." Jacob stood up and motioned for her to follow. "Come on," he said. "There's a small diner nearby. Let's get you and the kids something warm to eat first." As Laura rose from the bench, still holding her children close, she felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. Could she trust this man? Could anyone really help them? Only time would tell. But in that moment, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself a small glimmer of hope. Unbeknownst to both Jacob and Laura, this small act of kindness would set off a chain of events that neither could have imagined. What Jacob was about to receive in return for his compassion would change his life forever. And it was something far beyond material wealth. The diner wasn't fancy, but to Laura and her children, it felt like a small miracle. As they walked through the door, the warmth hit them like a soft embrace. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling food filled the air, and the low hum of quiet conversations added a comforting background. For a moment, it felt like they were stepping into a world far removed from the cold, harsh streets they had just left behind. Jacob guided them to a booth near the back, where it was quieter, more private. Laura slid into the seat with her children by her side, still unsure if this was all real. The kindness Jacob had shown felt almost too good to be true. But there he was, sitting across from them, his eyes filled with empathy. He quickly waved over a waitress, a kind older woman who smiled warmly at the children. "What can I get for you all tonight?" she asked, her voice soft and welcoming. Laura hesitated, her pride fighting with her overwhelming need to care for her kids. Before she could say anything, Jacob leaned in. "Get whatever you want," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is on me." The children's eyes widened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, a small smile tugged at the corners of Laura's mouth. She nodded at the waitress, and soon steaming plates of food arrived. For the next few minutes, Laura and her children ate in silence, their hunger overpowering any need for conversation. Jacob watched them, his heart full, as he realized just how much they needed this small act of kindness. As the plates emptied and the children's energy returned, Laura finally found her voice. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her eyes still red from earlier tears. "You didn't have to do any of this. We've been struggling for so long. No one's ever stopped to help us like this." Jacob shook his head. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "I've been down on my luck too in the past. I know what it's like to feel like the world has forgotten you. But no one should go through this alone." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Laura allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But as soon as that hope flickered, reality crept back in. This was just one meal. Tomorrow, she would still be homeless, her children still without a safe place to sleep. She didn't want to burden Jacob with her problems. He had already done more than enough. "I appreciate everything," she began, her voice trembling. "But I don't want to take more than you can give. We have nowhere to go tonight, but we'll manage. We always do." Jacob leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "No, you won't just manage," he said, his tone firm yet kind. "Look, I know I'm not rich, but I can't let you and your kids sleep on the streets. I have a small apartment. It's not much, but it's warm, and there's a couch you can stay on for a few nights until we figure something out. Laura's eyes filled with tears again, this time from a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She couldn't remember the last time someone had shown her such genuine compassion. But before she could respond, her son, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. His voice was soft, almost too quiet to hear. "Mum, can we go with him? Please?" The little boy's plea shattered whatever walls Laura had built around her heart. She looked down at her children, their tired eyes, their hopeful expressions, and knew that she couldn't let her pride get in the way of giving them what they needed. She nodded, wiping away the fresh tears that had begun to fall. "Yes, sweetie," she whispered, pulling them close. "We can go." Jacob smiled, relief flooding his face. "All right then," he said, standing up from the table. "Let's get you out of here and someplace warm." The walk to Jacob's apartment was short, but for Laura it felt like a journey towards something unknown, an uncertain future, but one that held more hope than she had felt in a long time. The neighborhood was quiet, the buildings old but sturdy. When they arrived at his small, modest apartment, Jacob unlocked the door and gestured them inside. It wasn't much, just a single-bedroom place with a small kitchen and a living room. But to Laura, it felt like a palace. Jacob quickly gathered some blankets and set up the couch for Laura and her children. "I know it's not a lot of space," he said, almost apologetically, "but it's warm and it's safe. You can stay as long as you need to." Laura looked around, taking it all in. It wasn't the size of the place that mattered. It was the feeling of safety, of being sheltered from the harsh world outside. She felt a deep sense of relief, like a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders, if only for a little while. "You've done so much for us," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how we can ever repay you." Jacob waved off her thanks. "You don't have to. Just get some rest tonight. We'll figure things out tomorrow." That night, as Laura lay on the couch with her children nestled close, she thought about everything that had happened. The world had been so cruel for so long, but tonight it had shown her a rare kindness. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that things could get better. But as she drifted into a restless sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something about Jacob's kindness felt too profound, too timely, as if their paths had crossed for a reason. Little did she know, fate had far more in store for her, Jacob, and her children than any of them could have ever imagined. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the small windows of Jacob's apartment, casting a soft glow on Laura and her children as they stirred awake. For the first time in months, they hadn't woken up to the harsh reality of the streets. Laura sat up slowly, her heart heavy with gratitude as she watched her children sleep peacefully beside her. The warmth of the blankets and the quiet of the apartment felt like a dream she didn't want to end. Jacob was already up, making coffee in the kitchen. When he noticed Laura was awake, he gave her a kind smile. "Good morning," he said softly. "I hope you slept well." Laura nodded, her voice still thick with emotion. "I did, thank you. I don't even know how to begin repaying you for everything." Jacob waved off her concern. "There's nothing to repay," he said. "Everyone needs help sometimes. I just did what I could." The children woke up soon after, and Jacob offered them breakfast. Nothing fancy, just toast and some scrambled eggs. But to Laura and her kids, it felt like a feast. As they sat together, a sense of calm and hope filled the room. For the first time in a long time, Laura allowed herself to believe that things might be turning around. After breakfast, Jacob sat down at the table, his face more serious than before. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "There's more I can do to help you. I have a friend who runs a local charity. They help families in need get back on their feet. I could make a call, see if they have any resources for you." Laura's heart skipped a beat. This was more than she ever could have hoped for. "That would mean the world to us," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to thank you." Jacob gave her a reassuring smile. "Let's just take it one step at a time." True to his word, Jacob made the call. By that afternoon, Laura found herself sitting in the office of a local charity worker, a kind woman named Sarah, who was ready to help. Sarah listened to Laura's story with patience and compassion, nodding as Laura explained how they had lost everything after her husband's sudden death. "I can't promise miracles overnight," Sarah said, "but we can definitely help. We can arrange temporary housing and we'll connect you with some programs to get you back on your feet." Laura could hardly believe what she was hearing. After months of despair, it seemed like the world was finally showing her a way forward. Tears filled her eyes as she thanked Sarah, and later, when she returned to Jacob's apartment, she could barely find the words to express her gratitude. "You've given us more than I could ever ask for," Laura said, looking at Jacob with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You didn't just give us a meal or a place to sleep, you gave us hope." Jacob smiled, but then he looked down, hesitating. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. "I didn't just help you because I wanted to do something good. I helped you because, not too long ago, I was in a similar situation. I lost everything after I got sick and couldn't work. I was homeless for a while too, and someone helped me. That's why I knew I had to help when I saw you on that bench." Laura was stunned. She hadn't expected that Jacob, who seemed so put together, had faced the same struggles. "I had no idea," she whispered. "You understand better than anyone." Jacob nodded. "I do. And that's why I want you to know that no matter how dark it seems, there's always a way forward. I was able to rebuild my life, and you will too. You're stronger than you know." Laura couldn't hold back the tears any longer. She stood up and hugged Jacob tightly, overwhelmed by the realization that her life could change just as his had. In the days that followed, the charity helped Laura find temporary housing, and with Jacob's continued support, she began to rebuild her life. She found a part-time job, and slowly but surely, she and her children started to find their footing again. The fear and uncertainty that had haunted her for so long began to fade, replaced by the steady belief that things would get better. One day, several months later, Laura sat in the same park where Jacob had found her, watching her children play. The sun was shining and the autumn chill had given way to a warm, promising spring. She thought about how far they had come and how one act of kindness from a stranger had completely transformed their lives. She smiled as she watched her children laugh and run, knowing that they were safe, happy, and loved. And she knew, without a doubt, that she would pay Jacob's kindness forward whenever she had the chance. Just as he had been her beacon of hope, she would be that for someone else. As Laura stood to leave the park, her heart full of gratitude, she whispered a silent prayer of thanks for Jacob, for the second chance at life, and for the hope that had carried her through her darkest days. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Stories of Hope for more real-life tales of transformation and kindness. Together, we can spread hope and make the world a better place. Turn on notifications to never miss an inspiring story.